Okay, so I had a few more people join in here. So I'm going to get started, and for those that are running a little bit behind, they can just join in when they get here and hopefully get enough of the information. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what the POPA and ATIA is all about, and understand a little bit about what that legislation and what those acts really entail. And then we're also going to talk about what a privacy impact assessment is and what that actually looks like out in the wild. Without further ado, let me get started here. I suspect the webinar to last about 30 to 45 minutes with some time at the end for the questions. So I'm going to try and wrap it up a little bit early today so you guys can at least get some lunch in you. And so who am I? My name is Damon Mascott, and I've had a decade of hands-on experience in the tech industry and have navigated a diverse range of roles, including retail computer sales and support, coordination of corporate IT support, account management, sales management, and currently my role as outside sales here at TRINUS. With my various roles, that's equipped me with a deep understanding of technical intricacies when it comes to IT, as well as the nuances of relationship building and client focus. And if you're new to TRINUS, TRINUS Technologies is a MSP/MSSP provider, so a managed solutions provider and a managed security solutions provider in Stony Plain, Alberta, and has been in operation since 1997. So our vision here at TRINUS is to be the Western Canadian leader of complete technology solutions for local government and small to medium-sized business, by delivering innovative and proven systems to solve any technological need. We value reliability, client focus, and professionalism here at TRINUS, and that's our key pillars for success. And today, we're going to talk about the POPA and ATIA. So with a raise of hands, maybe in the chat or through the raise function here in Teams, how many people already know what POPA and ATIA stands for? Okay, we got one person who knows what it is. So this is why we're going to have the conversation today. And for those who don't know, it's a piece of legislation, or at least a few acts. We're going to dive into what the purpose is, what the impacts are going to have on technology as a whole, and a little bit about what a privacy impact assessment is. So the POPA is the Protection of Privacy Act, and then the ATIA stands for Access to Information Act. And it looks like we've had a few people that have already had a few requests from their ratepayers, so that's wonderful. So, I mean, wonderful in the sense that people are understanding that they have this ability to access this information, but what that actually looks like and how those pieces of legislation come into play are going to be increasingly important. So we're going to go through that today. Hopefully that shines some light onto how IT should be implementing some of these practices. So why does this matter? Well, we know that municipalities handle a huge amount of personal and public information. The Protection of Privacy Act and the Access to Information Act are the new legal frameworks that are replacing FOIP. So FOIP is no longer around, that's been replaced. And this is not just for legal teams, it's obviously everybody in between. So it's for IT, it's for records management, it's for leadership and communications, as they're all impacted. The other thing that this helps cover is new things like AI, cloud tools, and remote work to make the environment more compliant, and it can also make it a little bit more complex, but that's also important as well. So since every municipality handles personal and public information, whether it's citizens' complaints, council decisions, or staff records, the POPA and the ATIA are the new rules of the road in Alberta and across Canada as well. So what makes this especially important today is that we're using more AI tools, we're using more cloud tools, and more digital systems than we have ever had. So one thing that we need to look after is the privacy, the security, and obviously the transparency as well. So without further complicating the matter, let's start by looking at what FOIP was and understanding how FOIP and the POPA and the ATIA have changed things. So before the POPA and the ATIA, Alberta municipalities had to follow a single law called FOIP, and that was the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. It served both of our privacy and access to information laws for decades. It was a very old piece of legislation, and unfortunately, FOIP didn't include a checklist for IT departments or talk about cloud systems directly, but it absolutely shaped how IT, records management, and privacy teams operated. So, for example, Section 38 of FOIP required reasonable security arrangements to be set up to protect personal information, and that's a fairly broad requirement from an IT perspective as to what reasonable security arrangements is, but that meant that we had to be very careful about the way that we think about things like access to controls, things like data retention, and security and storage. So over time, with the advancement of technology and how information is being stored and cloud technologies, the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner had issued guidelines on how to interpret FOIP properly, especially for modern age. So bulletins and advisory documents addressing cloud computing and data resiliency, the importance of logging and audit trails, risks of personal data being stored outside of Canada were kind of all formed and created from that OFC commissioner. But that didn't mean that that was necessarily covering all the bases. So while FOIP never said that you must have audit logs, it created legal obligations that required us to implement IT best practices, because if you remember, it said to take reasonable actions to secure your site. Well, again, what are those reasonable actions? So as MSP providers like us, we had to come up with some frameworks that would help us best implement IT best practices. So in many ways, FOIP pushed municipalities to modernize their systems, especially once digital record keeping, emails, cloud tools came online and became more the norm. We had things like personalized information storage and handling that enforced safeguards for storing resident or staff data, especially in digital systems. There were things like cloud and data resiliency, so required that data, especially with personal identifiers, be stored on servers located in Canada or had appropriate agreements in place. There was the audit trails and access logs, so IT systems were expected to maintain auditable who had access to what, when, and why. Records management applied to email, databases, file systems, backups. Digital records had to be searchable and retrievable and disposed based on retention rules. And then, of course, the information side of things. So the Freedom of Information Act also had any records, including emails, metadata, digital files, and even text messages on phones, could be requested by the public under FOIP. So, blast from the past, FOIP is no longer around, but it still needs to have some credit where credit is laid, as it provided some of the foundation and forced us all to ask the right questions about how we handle information in the digital era. So, FOIP was from 1995 to 2023, so rest in peace, FOIP, and that laid some groundwork for the POPA and the ATIA. So let's take a look at what the Protection of Privacy Act really entails. So the purpose of it is to protect personal and employee information. I think that's pretty straightforward. Key concepts of the Act is to have consent, privacy by design, breach notification, and privacy impact requirements, so PIA requirements. This applies to staff data. This applies to resident information. It applies to system use, surveillance, and AI tools. Highlight is focused on collection, use, disclosure, and safeguarding. So to kind of wrap that up, the POPA focuses entirely on protecting personal information of residents, of staff, and contractors. It also defines how municipalities can collect, use, and disclose personal information. It also requires privacy impact assessments when launching new tools like AI chatbots or cloud apps, new ERP systems, anything along those lines, anything that might have information of either ratepayers or internal staff or contractors. It also now states that if there's a breach that could cause harm, you must notify the individual and the privacy commissioner of either Alberta or of Canada, depending on where you're located. So whether you're launching a new ERP or updating your public forms, it's most likely that the Protection of Privacy Act is going to apply. Let's also define a little bit further of what the Access to Information Act is. So the purpose, again, is to ensure public access to records and decisions, so similar to FOIP in that regard. Key concepts are for record retention, explainability, auditability, and exemptions. Applies to council decisions, public records, digital communications, and the highlight is focused on transparency and access to record keeping. So really this is kind of like that freedom of information side of things in FOIP, but again, a little bit further because the ATIA is the new Access to Information Law, and it makes sure that citizens can access municipal records and understand how those decisions were made. It covers not just paper documents, but also emails, meetings, meeting minutes, system records, and even AI-generated content. So if you're using AI chatbot on your website, having that information on how that AI came to that conclusion or to those answers, that's also going to be related to the Access to Information Act. So municipalities need to ensure that those records are kept, retrievable, and understandable. The ATIA reinforces transparency, especially as we automate more and more things, and especially with the automation of AI, we need to be able to audit everything that happens within those systems. Now, this is something new that never really covered, was the privacy impact side of things. And if you're wondering, well, what is privacy impact or what does that actually mean? Well, a PIA is just a formal process that helps you identify privacy risks in your systems or services, ensures compliance with the POPA, documents how personal information is collected, used, and protected, and decides if mitigation steps are needed. So when is a PIA required? It's whenever you're implementing new software or systems that use personalized data or any sort of personal data, even from an internal perspective. Major changes to data collection or sharing, if you have AI tools or automation in public services, and any tool that could affect resident privacy. So the PIA isn't supposed to be a red tape item. It's really supposed to be acting as your defense if something were to go wrong. It documents what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're protecting the information involved. So it's required for most new tech tools or any tools that interact with personalized data, and it's especially critical when you're looking at automation or AI. We do have a couple trusted partners. We have a lady by the name of Jean Eaton. She's with a company called Information Manager. She helps us from privacy impact assessments when people are looking to get those done. Again, her contact information is going to be dropped in the chat at the end. So I would definitely say if you're needing a privacy impact assessment or you're not sure about if I need a privacy impact, she's always going to be a great resource for understanding what that looks like and how to help you out there. And we also have another firm called PrivacyWorks. We have a contact there named Adam, and his team at PrivacyWorks is all about doing freedom of information requests. So they actually will help you figure out what information needs to be added into a freedom of information request, and also the privacy impact assessments as well. So I'll have those guys added to the chat here at the end, and feel free to copy their information, send them an email, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions for them. Now we have to kind of understand FOIP versus the POPA and the ATIA. So we understand that there's this shift in legislation. As we understood, FOIP was the old one law for both privacy and access. The POPA is now dedicated for privacy, personal information, and data security. The ATIA, which is now, is focused on access, transparency, and public records. So again, the key differences between FOIP, as it was a very broad piece of legislation, and it was really brought in, if we look at it, prior to the advancement of technology. So it makes sense that it was a little outdated in that sense. And then the POPA and the ATIA are just more precise requirements from a technology perspective. POPA also addresses AI, automation, and privacy breaches, where it was pretty loosey-goosey before, and the ATIA reinforces the explainability and records retention. So FOIP did a lot. It unfortunately was trying to be a one-size-fit-all. The POPA and the ATIA break that up into two focused laws. Again, the POPA handles how you manage and protect your data. The ATIA ensures the public can access decisions and records transparency. So it makes it easier for departments like IT or records to know where their responsibility starts and ends, rather than having this all-in-one, one-size-fits-all FOIP. So how will the POPA and the ATIA affect IT and cybersecurity? Well, first things first, systems must be secure, searchable, and controlled, something that most municipalities were taking steps towards getting that done. Now it's a enforceable piece of legislation, whereas in FOIP it was not necessarily super enforced, but now it is. So IT must support things like data residency rules, so data must be stored in Canada. We have access controls on logging, so something that will actually record who has access to what and why and when. And then those PIA triggers, especially for any new tools coming online, anything AI related, surveillance related, or software as a service. So this could be things like your new ERP system or anything that might be holding ratepayer personalized information in them. So tools like chatbots, cloud email, Teams, file sharing apps may all raise a POPA and ATIA issue. So security policies must also align with the legal obligations. So this is kind of where IT, cybersecurity, and privacy all connect. Your systems really will need to be aligned with the new acts and the new laws. The data must be stored securely, access must be logged, and records must be retrievable. The POPA requires privacy by design, and the ATIA requires transparency and explainability. So if you're using an AI tool or a cloud system or storing sensitive information, these choices now have legal consequences, and you can't separate the tech decisions from a legal obligation anymore like it was in FOIP. What are some common risks to watch out for? Well, some of them are using public tools like ChatGPT or Google's Gemini with personalized information or personally identifiable information. And things like when I'm talking about using public AI tools, maybe it's a member of staff who is trying to respond to an email and they want it in a more friendly tone. So now they've uploaded their email to ChatGPT asking them to make this sound a little bit more friendly, right? I'm sure we've all been there where it's like, I just want to tell this person. But yeah, it's really, if you're putting that information into a public platform like that, then that can raise some issues with both the POPA and the ATIA side of things, because now it's no longer trackable as to how the AI decided to make that decision. You've now uploaded personalized and identifiable information in some capacity, so name, phone number, email, anything like that is now in a public platform. And now things like storing records in an unmanaged cloud drive could be another risk. So if you're putting council information and that council information might have some personally identifiable information into a Google Drive, and because it's a council package or something like that, that could also raise some cause for POPA and ATIA. Other things that you might want to be on the watch for is audit trails and sensitive actions. So understanding who has access to what. And there's other things like no formal retention schedules for email or digital records. Something that I think a lot of people still struggle with is knowing when to delete data and how to delete data and what's the best way of going about that. And then systems used for decision making without explainability or transparency. So again, using some of those examples of like a website AI chatbot, right? So you need to be able to know how that AI chatbot is receiving the information and how it's coming up with its decisions. If we start looking at what do we need to start doing, some of the things that you can start with is doing a compliance check. So you can start by mapping out your information systems, so understanding what tools do you use, where is the data being stored, who has access to it, why do they have access to it. If you're using AI on your website or any sort of automation or cloud tools, something that your records manager or your VoIP manager should be asking is if a privacy impact assessment has been done on those tools, and maybe that's a good start to understand if you need to do a privacy impact assessment on those tools. Other things you can do is review your contracts, especially with your IT vendors, and understand, do they have breach notification or data residency or retention clauses, or what does that all entail, so that you can have an understanding of what that is. So if you were ever to be called upon it, you have those answers to those questions. So yeah, like I say, map where personal and sensitive information is being stored, identify all systems being used for collection and sharing. Again, check and see if a privacy impact assessment needs to be done. Review your contracts with your vendors and talk to your VoIP or records officer if you have one, or designate a privacy lead. This doesn't need to be an overwhelming, check. It's just about knowing your environment and building habits of compliance, right? You want to be able to start putting some of these puzzle pieces together. What does this actually look like in practice? So some everyday examples of how the POPA and the ATIA are showing up in practice. And a good example would be an AI chatbot for 311 support. Let's start with your chatbot and say your municipality implements a 311 chatbot that handles resident inquiries, if it's collecting names, addresses, complaint details. You got to understand that that's probably going to be dealing with personal information, and that personal information is now covered under the POPA, and that triggers likely the need for a privacy impact assessment to be done, because now you're introducing a new system that automatically interacts with resident data. So I say resident data as in the name, email, phone number, that sort of thing that they might be putting into the 311 chatbot. So that PIA might need to be done from a mitigation and understanding perspective of what actually all happens in there. And then the ATIA also applies because now residents have the right to know how decisions or responses are being generated from that AI chatbot. So if, for example, the chatbot gives incorrect info or filters complaints automatically, your municipality must be able to explain that logic if it was ever to be called upon, and produce records if requested on how that chatbot was coming up with its answers or was filing those complaints. So the chatbot isn't just a tech tool, it's part of your public-facing operations, and so it needs to be treated as such. Other good example would be council minutes passed into ChatGPT. So we've had a few examples where we've seen municipalities put their council minutes into ChatGPT or Google Gemini or Google Notebook LM to come up with either a podcast or a summary of those minutes and then post on their website and that sort of thing. So the thing is if you're posting or pasting that information into ChatGPT or Notebook LM or Google Gemini, it might seem harmless, but that's a big trigger for the POPA, because if those minutes contained any resident names, addresses, phone numbers, anything that might be identifiable, uploading it into ChatGPT or any of those online platforms, you might be potentially disclosing personal information to third parties such as like OpenAI or to Google without that person's consent or legal authority to do so. So that would be considered a breach under the POPA. From that example, an ATIA perspective is once it's in ChatGPT or any of those online platforms, you've also lost control over that record. You can't retrieve it. You can't figure out what the logic was for that AI to come up with that summary. There's no audit trail. If a resident says, how did you come up with that summary? You can't answer with confidence because that's all built into that program's backend. You don't have access to that backend. So that turns into a transparency failure. Lastly, other things we've seen shared with Google Drive for council docs. So lastly, let's say council documents were being shared via someone's personal Google Drive, even if the files are only accessible to to those specific staff members. This creates a major risk under both POPA and ATIA, because from a POPA standpoint, you've now lost custody and control of those documents because now it's on a public platform, and personal information could be sitting on infrastructure that your IT team doesn't manage. So there's no way to ensure encryption, access logging, or even breach detection. And then from an ATIA side, it's unclear who has access to which version and when. And if someone edits the file before it's reviewed to council, but there's no version tracking or no reliable audit trail, that means if someone submits an access request, you can't be fully confident that you're giving them the full or final record, and that becomes a compliance gap. So just some real world examples there. So it's really, whether it's a chatbot or a file sharing program or tools like ChatGPT, each one can have its own legal implications if not managed properly. And it is happening more often than not, especially in municipalities across Canada. And the key takeaway from this is that if your system interacts with personal information or produces public records, it needs to be governed. Just to recap, and what you can do today is POPA is really anything that has to do with privacy or personal data. The ATIA is anything that has anything to do with access and records. Both require some sort of human oversight. I would say definitely don't have an AI oversight on that. Both require some good documentation and systems that protect and explain how that data is being stored, accessed, who has access to it, and all of those things. And then the other thing to remember is that privacy, transparency, and accountability must be built into every system that you use. And if you're not sure if any of those pieces are being implemented with your IT systems, to review your systems with your team, with your legal team, with your communications team, with your records and privacy management team, and build some privacy and access into your digital workflows. So tried to wrap that up within about 45 minutes. I think I did a fairly good job, so I'm going to open it up for some questions here. I think I had a couple fly in here while I was speaking here. So I have one question from Jason. Is data residency now the same for all provinces, and what types of data might be required, or what types of data might require mandatory data residency in Canada? So I believe the legislation is the data must be stored within Canada. I think that's still being pulled from FOIP. So from that perspective, I don't think anything like that changes. I would say any sort of AI platform needs to be measured and trackable and must also be stored locally or in Canada. And then what type of data might require mandatory data residency? So anything that might be email related, so like the Microsoft 365, you can set your data residency to Canada. So anything being stored in SharePoint or OneDrive or email should be stored in Canada, as we have different laws than what the United States has, and the United States has different laws than what Poland might have, and that sort of thing. So that's why that data residency is still a mandatory request to be within Canada. Same things can be said to any online or cloud-based ERP provider. Having that information stored within Canada is a must and would follow under various different legislations in that regard. We will have some of these webinars coming out on September 18th, and that's going to help people understand building effective data retention policies. October 16th, we have phishing with AI-powered threats. And then November 20th, we have responsible AI use for municipalities.